Welcome everyone officially to today's webinar that's provided by Mary Lee. The name of this offering is it's a sit spot webinar. It's focused on this common practice within nature-based early childhood education. And I'll add a little asterisk there that it goes much further beyond that, as we'll be talking about as well. So all the way up to adults, but don't want to spoil the surprise too much here. I am one of your presenters today. My name is Marcos Stoltzfus. I am the Director of Environmental Education here at Mary Lee Environmental Learning Center of Goshen College. And I'm joined by my colleague, who I will let introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Carol Good Elliott, and I am an environmental educator here at Mary Lee and the lead nature preschool teacher for our nature preschool at Mary Lee.
Great, and thanks to everyone who's joined us. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of what we're hoping to cover today, we're focused on the topic of sit spots, one element within nature-based early childhood education. And we're going to start by giving a little bit of a definition and some examples of what that can include or what it looks like. Then we're going to move into thinking about what that looks like in practice. So we'll talk about how it can fit into different program structures, and then the golden piece of our program, we think anyhow, is like, what does it actually look like, and how do you facilitate this, particularly with children, as that comes most directly from our experience, but just kind of like, how do you do that on a regular basis? And then finally, before we move into some Q&A, we will cover just briefly a little bit of the benefits that accrue to children and just people in general when they engage in this kind of a practice, because we know that that's an important component for teachers and other administrators as well. So that's the plan for today. We're hoping to keep it to just about an hour total, and we'll get you out of here by 5 o'clock Eastern time. To give a little bit of context, we are located in northern Indiana. We are, I'd say, about halfway between the South Bend area and Fort Wayne area. We are a 1,200 acre nature preserve owned by Goshen College, and we have a variety of programs, but most recently here in the past number of years, we've been on this kind of journey of nature-based early childhood education. Specifically, what that has meant for us regarding sit spots is that we've had a chance to practice that particular element in a number of different programs. Chronologically for us, one of the first places that we really got into that was with a Kinder Forest program, basically a monthly forest school with a local school district that we partnered with. Right now, we've had the bulk of our experience working with sit spots with our nature preschool. That is held in conjunction with the local Cole Family Center YMCA and the school district. And we've gotten into some of the details of that in other webinars and offerings that we've provided. So we're not going to go too much into the structure of that program. But we've also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we've also done sit spots for a variety of other ages and in other programs as well, such as after school or even with adults, including the graduate students who are here to get their master's in environmental education. So just as a brief context, that's a little bit of what we're going to be talking about. We're kind of in a Great Lakes set of ecosystems here, and we're talking about a variety of ages, but especially with the preschool students most recently. So what is a sit spot? Rather than boring you with a bunch of definitions right off the bat, we'll get to that boring part, don't worry. We thought we'd start off with a little bit of a video, a compilation of clips that show a sit spot in action. And so you're going to be seeing especially our outdoor classroom and other outdoor places. The thing that you're going to want to be looking for here are the students kind of in their location. We'll talk about how they choose those and when that changes, if it does, but look at especially the behaviors that you're seeing and kind of what's happening in the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up our video here, and we'll get started. Okay, so hopefully that gives us at least a starting point. And Carol, I can tell that at least a few of those videos came from your sit spot, where you kind of get a few good shots of a few students, and you kind of get a really good sense of what they're up to on a daily basis. So definitions. Let's talk a little bit about what these things are that we're bandying about the phrase so quickly here. Well, there's a few different definitions I'm going to offer. There's a book that we reference from time to time. It's called Coyote's Guide to Connecting with Nature. And the way that the author of this book describes it is a place in the natural world where you visit all the time. It's a place that you get connected with, essentially. And that's where you learn to sit still, alone, often, and quietly. And the suggestion there is that that's before one would play and explore the beyond. So that's one kind of working definition. Another comes to us from the Teton Science Schools. They describe sit spots as places to go and sit quietly, observe, and reflect. Furthermore, to pay careful attention to observations, sights, sounds, smells, and feelings that one notices while one is in their sit spot. We're pretty similar there. Our definition is that a sit spot is a student selected location in the outdoor classroom, a place which students routinely visit to observe each program day. And for us, we include that there's a little bit of a time frame there. We usually are between a 5 and 15-minute increment. And this is something that we do rain or shine, snow or sun. So what is this all about? Like, why do we do sit spots, or kind of what's the theory or the thinking behind them? Well, some of the important elements are that this is a way that place-based education happens in practice. And a place-based approach would describe frequent and repeated visits to the same location to especially become in tune with some of the seasonal changes that are going on. Now, while these are not all the same student nor in the same exact spot, you can see on these photos that we do it right off the bat when we start school off in the fall, when there's lots of greenery. Those students are going to continue to visit that place as that transitions and as they begin to see the leaves start to color, like in the middle photo, all the way through into the snowy winter months. And of course, at this time of year, we're starting to see some of those green leaves and buds start to pop back out. So that gives those students a chance to start to notice things kind of at a different scale than you do even just walking out on a trail every day. And there's certainly benefits to that too, but that gives them a chance to really get in tune with kind of a micro habitat or a very specific area, and that they really can begin to have some ownership over as well. That is their spot. They really become the expert of that location. Some other kind of reasons that we keep this in our program is that it's a chance for quiet and solitude. It's a chance for the student to have some individual or alone time in a day that may not provide that to them, that may not have kind of a resting period or a time to kind of have a little bit of alone time from a social perspective as well. So that's one reason to include this in a program. And in terms of where this can happen, we talk about how we would like to see sit spots happen outside. And that does not have to be at a 1,200 acre nature preserve like we have at Mary Lee. We've talked to folks who have done sit spots on their balcony of their apartment building, at a local park, or basically anywhere else along the way, but it should be outside somewhere. And so I really like this picture on the far right-hand side, because there's a student just sitting out here in the grass and the playground equipment is in the background, but it's clear that she's engaging very differently than she normally would in this outdoor location and space. So that gives just a little bit of a taste of the background of kind of how we think about this element of our programming, but we want to quickly jump into, like, what does that actually look like? Like, what happens during a sit spot? And for that, I am going to turn it over to you, Carol.
Great. Thank you for that great introduction, Marcos. So what actually does happen during sit spots for us? Well, my context for doing sit spots the most at Mary Lee is with 4 and 5-year-old preschoolers. I've also done this with kindergarten students. In a past life, I did it with fifth graders many, many, many years ago. But I'm really going to be focusing in on this younger children and kind of working with younger children in this context. So there are many different behaviors that we see during sit spots. There are many different behaviors that we consider appropriate for 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds in sit spots. And as I talk through some of these, I hope that you think back to the video that you saw at the beginning, and perhaps you might think, were all of those behaviors what we would consider our goal for sit spot behavior or not? So that's a thing to think about a little bit. As I talk through and you have a chance to look at some photos that we've also taken of children in their sit spots as well. So some behaviors that we consider within a very normal range, a good fit for sit spot for us here with these children, is things like using a notebook to draw or to write or to imagine writing in, because many of these children are pre-literate, right? So they're figuring out letters, they know that somehow people make marks on paper and that means something. And so a lot of them are practicing that kind of skill. They might be drawing pictures. They might be drawing pictures of the unicorn they're imagining beside them in their sit spot. Or they might be doing a leaf rubbing with their pencil or a crayon too. Another thing certainly is things like getting out their hand lenses and looking at, like the child in the far left here, very closely examining the tree trunk next to him. They might be picking up objects that are around them, the leaves, the flowers, the moss, the bark that's falling off the log, to examine those things closely. Some other types of things would be including things like laying down on their back, staring up at the sky, or laying on their bellies, looking down at the ground. And there are quite a few days when I observe children during our sit spot time who are just clearly really relaxing for a part of that time, laying down and resting and being still. So that also can be fairly common for quite a few of them. For some of these children, they have gotten up extremely early in the morning to get to a childcare provider before preschool starts, for example. We've had children already fall asleep during sit spot time. So that also is completely acceptable. It's a sign to me that they are really comfortable and relaxed in that space. So that's also very appropriate behavior for a sit spot time in our context. Some other types of activities that we've seen happening, taking sticks to do many things, threading leaves onto a stick, so like pulling them down over. There was a photo earlier in the slideshow of a child with his pencil completely loaded with leaves that he had stuck on the pencil, and then he was writing with the pencil. That is also totally fine. Sticks are used for tapping on things. I think we may have seen that in the video earlier. Sometimes that tapping can be quite loud. Sometimes it can be very distracting. Other times it's much more quiet and experimental. The students are clearly playing with, what does it sound like if I tap here versus there on this thing versus that thing? Lots of digging in the soil, balancing one object on top of another, making little stacks of things, trying to balance a leaf on their own head. I mean, there are many ways that the children are engaging with the things around them and exploring the space around them. Some other kinds of things that we see happen as well include moving around in their spaces. So in some of the definitions that Marcos shared, it talks about sitting still, being still. And for some of these children in this age range, that is very developmentally available for them. For others, it's not. And we recognize that. And so we're paying attention to each child as an individual and how they themselves are able to interact and engage with sit spots. And we know that for some of them, movement is a thing that needs to happen for at least part of the time. And so we'll see children stand up, and as long as they're within, I would say, about a 6-foot radius of where their sit spot is, I'm comfortable with that. If they're not trying to engage the other children who are around them and distract the other children around them at that time. So they may be moving around, they may be climbing up and kneeling on the log and looking to see what's on the other side. They may be, as the child in the picture on the right, laying down on their log and about to fall off on the side of it. They may be sitting very still, like the child farther back in that photo. They might be making things, like the picture on the left here. That's an acorn cap that had mud packed into it and an empty snail shell, and then little tiny flower buds that were just starting to come up that this child had tucked into the mud to make a little tiny garden that she wanted to share with everyone. So there are many kinds of behaviors like those that happen. Sometimes there will be little tiny shelters for, I don't know, millipedes, worms, all kinds of things have happened during sit spot time. So many things that are happening of those sorts. And all of those we feel are really appropriate uses of that time to explore and get to know aspects of their space. So that's kind of an introduction of some of the behaviors that we anticipate and that we experience and have noticed during our sit spot times with young children. So I hope you're getting the idea that there isn't just one way to do sit spots, and there isn't just one way to be in a sit spot based on what we're saying. So I'd like to talk a little bit more now at this point about how we actually facilitate sit spots in our nature preschool. So that's just one model, certainly, but to give you an example of how do we start this out? How do we structure it? How do we introduce it? All kinds of things like that. How do we make this happen in the course of a 9-month school year with these children? So some things that we needed to think about as we were getting started was, when did we want to include sit spots in the day of programming with these children, in the time they were outside with us? And there were a number of different things that we were thinking through with that. So one option certainly is at the very beginning of their time to have sit spot and use it sort of as a centering and grounding time, a transition time from, okay, we've been at our indoor classroom in the morning, we've had lunch, and now we're in this space. And what do we do in this space? And as a way to kind of settle in and breathe into that space a bit before we started transitioning into some other kinds of exploration. Another way to do sit spot would have been to make it something that the children could choose to engage in on their own time, anytime throughout their time with us. And another option would be to think about having it at the very end of the day, or right towards the end of the day, sort of as a time to wrap up, to reflect on what they have been doing throughout the day before leaving. And all of those have lots of merit and lots of value. One thing
I'll just jump in real quick if it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about how a few years back when we were doing our partnership with the kindergarten for our Kinderforce program, that even within 2 or 3 teachers in the same grade that were coming, there was variation in their thought about when and how they wanted to do it. And some liked it at the very beginning because that was a way to kind of center, like you were saying. And another was saying, my students are so excited by the time we get out to the woods, I can't possibly kind of get them to settle down. Mm-hmm. I would much rather let them play and engage and kind of run about. And then we'll do that at the end because that's a way to kind of breathe out at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And so just in terms of, especially working with kiddos, I think there's something to be said about paying attention to the particular students that we have there.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with that too.
And then the last one I was going to add in, you mentioned doing it on your own. I like that. Is this where you're going next?
That's where I was going next.
Okay, go for it.
The little guy in the middle picture here. So that's a preschooler from our very first year of preschool here at Mary Lee, which happened to be the year that the pandemic started. And so that photo is one that his mother actually sent to us shortly after lockdown started, when we were no longer meeting with the children. So we had had them from September through the first part of March, and then all of a sudden we were gone. And this child started asking his mother, his parents, if he could just go outside. He wanted to go outside in his yard, and he wanted to have some time to sit by the tree and just be there by himself. And so he was creating his own sit spot time in his day. And that was something that was clearly important to him. And we have gotten to see him in the past couple weeks, actually, at a different program as now a first grader. And he's clearly still very engaged in similar ways. So that's just one fun story of how sit spots can work for some individuals anyway. All right. So how do we introduce this? How do we actually get it started in a day and in our school year? So at the very beginning of the school year, certainly all of these children have many new routines to learn. And we start working on sit spot routine with them right from the very beginning of their time coming out and spending time with us at Mary Lee. Within our first day of preschool, we're spending time exploring our classroom space, and we do that using a game, something that we've found is helpful for our children anyway in our setting, where we divide up the children amongst the various teachers who are out with them, and we take each little group goes to different corners of the classroom and then calls to the other groups, and we take turns like going and finding each other. Because in our classroom space, there are many fairly young saplings, so there's a lot of leaf cover that obscures the view for many of the children at the height that they're at that very beginning part of the year. And so we're trying to help them navigate their way through the space, learn their way around it, find the edges, find the boundaries, and start to get a sense of what the lay of the land is there. Where are the cool logs to sit on? What is the space like? So we use a game to introduce it in that way. We also have used some books and stories that are set up to help children get a sense of what it could be like to sit quietly and alone outside and have their own time and space outside in a quiet way. One of those books is called the Sit Spot Book. It was actually written by one of our graduate students that she has shared with us and graciously allowed us to use that and share it with others as well. There are other children's books as well that have to do with, mindfulness practices, and that some picture books about noticing and wondering. So those are some of the types of books that we have used before. And then we use a singing bowl bell as a signal bell. And so that I also used to introduce that to the children right from the very beginning. That is one that they quickly learn the signal that when we hear the bell ring once, that means our sit spot time has started, and we sit down and we are quieting ourselves. We're trying to quiet ourselves on the inside and on the outside and be in that space. And then after a few minutes, we'll ring the bell twice, and that's the time that our sit spot ends and we can get up and go to our community circle. And so we're working on reinforcing those routines right from the very start of school. As far as actually choosing spots themselves, then, we allow children to choose their own sit spots. And not all of them are up high on a stump like this. This is one of our Kinder Forest kiddos from a number of years ago. There was definitely some vying for that particular sit spot location with that particular group of children.
Not to mention the fact that when an uninitiated adult chaperone who didn't kind of know what we were up to came out one time to help supervise, their response was, "Get down from that log. What are you doing up there?" And the student had to say, "Well, this is my sit spot and it's where I'm supposed to be right now."
I'm supposed to be here.
That was a whole other thing.
Yes, it was. Yeah. So we do want the children to choose spots that they find interesting and engaging, a place that they want to be as much as possible. Um, what we have done to help with this is actually place rocks at various places throughout our outdoor classroom. More rocks than there are children in interesting places. And we ask the children to find a spot by a rock. And if they wanted to sit on the rock, that was fine. If they wanted to sit next to the rock, that was fine. But that those were the places, and we had intentionally spaced them apart far enough so that there would be an appropriate distance between the children as well. Um, that's another piece that we talk about with them in our introduction to them, is like the practicing putting their arms out. Um, they need to be farther away from each other than their hands can touch, right? So um, lots of work on spatial relationship skills there with preschoolers for figuring out that kind of piece too. So we're trying to space them at least 10 feet apart if we can. And the size of the space might determine how far apart you can be with the number of children you have as well, or with the number of adults, depending on who you're doing sit spots with. We also wanted to make sure that we could always see each child. And when I say we, I mean the group of teachers, the adults that are in that classroom space on a given day, intentionally choose sit spots so we can position ourselves in a way that we can see everywhere in the classroom, to make sure that we don't have a child who is maybe choosing to get up and wander off, or is needing help with something. So those are things that we're paying attention to as we're setting up and introducing sit spot times. Let's see, then as far as facilitating it goes, we do have the children return to that same sit spot time after time, day after day throughout the school year. Now, there's a little asterisk when I say that. We'll get to the asterisk in a second here, but in the photo here, I chose this one in particular because in this picture, if you look closely towards the right-hand side, about face level from this child, you see a photo hanging from a tree. So we use photo markers for the children, and put those photos of them up at their sit spot location once they have settled on a location. We usually do give them a couple days or part of a week to choose various different sit spots, different days, and then settle on one by the end of that first week. And then we put up their photos so that they know that's their spot. And the adults also know that's their spot. We can help them find their way back there.
I was going to chime in to say that exact thing, because there's
Yeah.
plenty of times, especially like if there's a sub as an instructor, or if
Mhm.
someone's not out there as regularly, or especially as the students are getting kind of familiar with their places, that I want to reinforce that they need to be in their spot, but I don't know where it is. And they may not either remember or be willing to tell me because they are wanting to choose something different. So having those
Exactly.
labels, especially at that kind of transition point, can be really helpful.
Mhm. Definitely, yes. And for our setting, since we are a publicly available space, we don't want to put children's names there. And also the children are not reading yet. So we are intentionally using only photographs and not any names associated with those photographs. That's a choice that we are making for our context. Um, so we do mark those spots to help them find that place again. Now, that asterisk I mentioned is that sometimes we have sit spots in other locations on certain days throughout our school year. And during the video, you saw a time block in which there were children out in an area that was clearly very tall grasses that were kind of laid down by the wind, by snow, etc. That was the same preschoolers um, in a different location at Mary Lee, because we do once a week go for an excursion to a different location, explore other parts of Mary Lee. There also are days when we'll need to not be in the woods if it's a very high wind day, for example. We'll have our classroom time our exploration time in a different space that's much more open and not under tree cover. So we still try to have sit spots almost every day anyway, in a new place to practice sitting and having alone time without an adult or other kids always talking at us. So that's one of the pieces as well that many children have appreciated.
Carol, I think about how when we do those sit spots on occasions elsewhere from like
Mhm,
not their normal spot, just about how that provides them with a little bit of a comparative with their typical spot. And they're
mhm,
seeing differences and noticing things, but maybe differently than something that's changed since the last time that they were there, for example.
mhm. Yes. And some of the children really key in on those things. For others, it's simply an fun opportunity to be in a new place too. Some of them are excited to explore new spaces enough that that's really important to them. We also really work to reinforce with the children that this is a time that is meant to be quiet and exploratory, um, without distracting the people around them. And that's a hard concept for some preschoolers to get, for sure, where they're very self-focused, developmentally appropriately, very self-focused. And so trying to help them understand that, that really loud drumming that you're doing constantly right now is actually a problem. Let's explore a different way. And you can do more of that during our playtime. Um, so that is a piece that we need to do with our facilitation as well. Um, and we'll talk a bit about how we approach that with the children in a little bit here. Other pieces of facilitating. So very early in the year, we start out with our sit spots only being 4 to 5 minutes. It doesn't take very long, in our experience anyway, with our preschoolers to get to at least 10 minutes a day. And at this point, there are many days that we're going 15 minutes, and sometimes a little bit more. Um, as the children have settled into that routine and have developed a lot more self-regulation, than they had at the very beginning of the school year, that's something that we're able to do, is extend our time. Um, I have noticed as I've done this that often at the first part of our sit spot time, many days, there's quite a bit of movement, wiggling, settling, fidgeting going on. Sometimes there's a little bit of talking to themselves or singing to themselves, a lot of banging. And then often after about 10 minutes, things just kind of settle and it gets really still for a little bit. And at that point, I'm getting the sense that they've had a chance to kind of move through the fidgets and settle in and relax a bit. And I try to always, as much as I can, allow a few more minutes for that settled time for them as well before we need to cut off sit spot time to move on to other things. Another aspect of our sit spot practice is that as soon as sit spots ends and the bell rings twice, we all go to our community circle time. And there's a community time afterward that includes a chance for children to share observations and things that they noticed during their sit spot time or things that they were thinking about during their sit spot time. We are choosing, based on our timing, to structure it such that the community leader, whichever child that is, chooses 3 people to share about sit spot from a given day. Even though there may be 20 hands up, they choose 3 people. And then afterward, I try and make sure that there is space that children are aware to, or know that I am very willing always to hear what they have noticed and want to share, even if they didn't get to share it during sit spot time. And we have at times had a kind of a gallery space, a log in the middle of the community circle or some other place set up that children can put things that they have found or noticed during sit spot that they want other people to get to see as well. So that is a way that we try and structure our community time as well, related to sit spots in particular. One of the factors certainly that we think about is weather, and we do adjust our sit spots based some on weather as well. We do sit spots in all kinds of weather. We do sit spots when it is very cold and snowing. We do sit spots when it is raining. We don't do sit spots when it is thundering because we're not outside with them at that time, but under almost all other conditions, we will have sit spots. When it does get really cold or super muddy, we provide something we call sit-upons. And I know a lot of different places have different types of sit-upons. We have gotten like the closed foam camping pads and cut those into sections that are big enough that a child's whole body can sit on it. And we take those along out. That provides insulation when the ground is very cold, and it also provides protection from the moisture. Now, the children are coming in their rain pants, so they have a protection from moisture already, but that extra layer helps keep the pants a little bit drier longer, and they're not getting that cold seeping in through as well. I guess the only other weather thing that I'd say is, again, I think I mentioned earlier, if we have high wind days, that we will do sit spots in a different location rather than in our wooded classroom space. Let's see, other things. I think you're jumping into this one now, right, Marcos?
I think, yeah, I'm going to take this one. Yep.
Okay.
So Carol's really spent a lot of time kind of talking about what the kids are doing and how we introduce that, but we wanted to give some specific time to what the adults are doing during the sit spot time, because we find that that really is a critical component, and it can make or break the student's experience. And, you know, this isn't going to be a big shocker, but if you've heard the like do as I say, not as I do kind of a thing, like that applies here, because, you know, people need to, especially young people, need to see you doing the thing that you're wanting them to do. And so you can see here on the left-hand picture, there's Carol's back. She's sitting there at her sit spot. She goes to her same sit spot every time, and she's quiet and doing all those same things that she's wanting the students to be doing. Sometimes we have a little extra help. For example, on the right-hand picture was a day that we had done a field trip, and so we had some extra parents along as chaperones, and we invited them to do it as well. And you know, so it's not a regular thing, but here we have a caregiver who is doing sit spot with a child, and it's a lap sit spot. And so I think that's kind of a special thing to do from time to time too. But the important piece is that we found when adults are, you know, like chatting with each other or talking or aren't doing the thing that we want the students to do, they are much less successful at trying to do that also. Okay.
Yeah, or if they're on their phones a lot, that's a non-starter also.
So like journaling and modeling journaling can be a great example as well. We try to remember that it takes time for the students to settle into the practice. And so we do kind of give them that chance. Carol talked about how we slowly ease into the length of time, but also, you know, the students, if they've not experienced this before, may not know what to do. And so we try to model also like picking up a leaf and looking at it, or making little artwork pieces, or like actively doing things, laying down and looking up at the sky, for example, because the students don't always know that that's an allowable thing, especially at the outset. The really critical piece is, okay, what do you do when the students aren't sit spotting in the way that we might like them to? And believe it or not, students don't always do as they're told, right? But we patiently redirect that and help them out. The key here that we have found is that it can be incredibly distracting for other students for a teacher to redirect a student from either far away loudly, let's say. And so we try to minimize the disruption of redirection whenever we can. This ties back to when Carol was talking about the sight lines and making sure that we can monitor students. A lot of times it's really quite realistic to be able to kind of like flag a student down, or sometimes they're kind of like looking at you anyways to see what the reaction is going to be. And so as much as possible, we'll kind of like, you know, do nonverbal reminders that this is a time to be, in some cases we might say like you ought to be sitting, or this is a time for being quiet, or, you know, a head shake or something like that. And as many of you have worked with children, you'll know that for many students, that's going to be sufficient, and they're going to, straighten up real quick or whatever. And that's not going to be the case for all students. And so there are times when the educators in our program feel very free to stand up, and we quietly walk over to the student and we crouch down and we whisper to them and have the conversation that we need to reinforce the expectations that we ought to that they should be observing. That's different than saying, Jackson, I need you to sit down. It's sit spot time. Like, I want to make that really clear that we're trying to do that in a way that it's possible if a student was looking in the other direction from the student who needed redirection, that they don't even know that that redirection has happened at all. There are times when we might want to revisit the expectations after school breaks, especially. It can be helpful to just remind folks of what routine we're trying to do here. And at some points, we find that changing up the sit spot is actually very important. So often we'll keep those same sit spots throughout the whole year so they can get the benefit of all those seasonal changes. But developmentally, there are times when we've had students that have been kind of clustered around one teacher because they're just at a point where they needed much more constant redirection than standing up and walking would really allow. And so for those students, we might have the teacher like within arm's reach, even if it's to that extent, but they might not need that the whole year long. And as they practice that self-regulation and as they get better at it, just this year, for example, we spread some students out that we found, okay, being close was actually becoming more of a distraction. And so we don't think of sit spots as immutable that can never be changed. So again, just some of the tools that are kind of in the tool belt for the practitioner here. The other piece, Carol was kind of mentioning how we get into the community circle afterwards in our program. The sharing that can happen about discoveries within SitSpot can take many different forms. The important thing we feel is that there is a chance to report out that these are those sit spots that they're getting ownership over. And so the students need to have the validation of hearing about the thing that they've discovered. And so we often try to model that curiosity and the excitement and enthusiasm of something that might have a great deal of meaning for the one student who is trying to share. And frankly, a lot of times they discover stuff that like is brand new to us, or like I've studied biology and environmental science, but there's a thing that we found that is the first time that I've seen that particular phenomenon, or that I haven't seen in that particular way. And so these students are absolutely making discoveries on a regular basis that are worth sharing, and them hearing that they're valuable to be paid attention to and listened to. Okay, so maybe this should have been at the beginning of the presentation. I don't know, you know a little bit more about it, but now let's talk about like, well, why are we actually doing it? There's a lot going on in the world today, and a lot of students have a lot of things happening, from the time they wake up all the way to the end of the day. A lot of times that's very structured time. In some cases, it can be that they just don't have that time alone, or there's screens in front of them a lot of the time. And so in many ways, we feel like it's valuable for the students just to be able to relax, just to be able to breathe. And so, we see some of the students where, like the one on the right, they're just checked out, and that's what they need at that moment. And so in part, we're providing that in the day within nature, because there's so much that's going on as well. In terms of some of the developmental benefits that we see research shows related to these sit spots, the social benefits are probably the category that's the least intuitive, or that are kind of surrounding sit spot, but maybe not happening directly in the moment. The way I describe that is when we're doing the community circle, they're often practicing their communication skills or comparing what's going on at one child's sit spot to their own as they're listening. But also there's something about the idea that everybody is doing this at the same time. And there's a buzz of excitement when we finally ring the bell at the end and everybody stands up at the same time. So there's kind of a social aspect to doing this, even though it's an individual kind of an activity. Over on the emotional side, this really helps the students, as we've mentioned, with their self-regulatory skills. They're building autonomy. This is a space that is kind of their own time, temporal space I'm talking, right? Like they're on their own. They're not necessarily like getting direction, and they're building those connections, as it says here, the empathy connections to the non-human world. We had a student who described watching the formation of a mushroom over multiple visits to his sit spot. And like, what a cool way to connect to a life cycle of a thing that otherwise most of us probably don't have a whole lot of connections to. Down on that cognitive quadrant, I mentioned that there's so much going on in nature, that stimulates our brains in really important ways. And hearing different bird songs can really be a way of practicing cognitive processing in ways that are important, especially to a developing child. Research has shown that being outside even for short stretches of time can reduce the effects of ADHD. We noticed that these students also then have physical benefits that accrue, and the research shows like there's reduced hormones of stress hormones, reduced incidences of anxiety. So these are all things that like biologically or physiologically, the research shows spending time in nature at all does. And this is an example of a time when we're really trying to really focus on that in a pretty important way. Okay, it is worth noting that we think sit spots are helpful for learning or academic perspectives as well, although I don't always like to go there right off the bat, because that's not necessarily the reason that we do it. That said, we use sit spot discoveries to inform our curriculum development. We follow an emergent curriculum, and so we don't always know what the students' interests are going to lead us to. This is a great pulse for us to hear what they're paying attention to and where their interests might lead our class. A lot of times we make connections to concepts or ideas we've talked about before. So maybe in the indoor classroom, we're talking about signs of fall or changing seasons. Well, in their sit spot, the leaves are falling and they're noticing that. And so it's making it much more relevant. Especially at older grades, we find that there's more overt connections to academic efforts. So for example, on the right here, this is a piece of student work where after a forest visit, they were working on composition and specifically thinking about ordering. So as you read through here, and I can do a little bit of translating, listen for those ordering words, what happened first, next, all that kind of thing. First, at my sit spot, I got comfy, as in comfortable, and it is cool. Then I got in, or maybe out, my journal. Next, free time is fun to play in the woods. Then I had fun with the activities that we had making mud. Finally, we come back to school. We had fun. So some very, very clear examples of ordering that the teacher was using, not on the day, but referencing their sit spot and what was happening during it. Okay, I got one more video that that I'd like to show that really demonstrates, I think, something powerful that can happen in sit spots. For now, I'll just list it as an investigation. And I invite you to watch and see kind of what exactly is being investigated and how the student is going about it. Let's see here. So what I love about that clip is that I see all the signs of a budding scientist going on there. So when we think about variables, the student was changing the size of the stick that he was using to tap. He started off with small, he went big. He was varying the cadences and the rhythm, and kind of there's some quick short movements and there's big whacks, and then there was some kind of more regular ones. He also encountered a challenge where it got kind of put off to the side, and so he had to see if he might be able to replicate that experiment that he was exploring earlier. And so all of these, I would argue, are evidence of learning, albeit in the form of play. And so one of the ways that we've worked to articulate and explore that is in this document that I have the front page of excerpted here. It's a PDF that we have on our website called SitSpot Pedagogy and Academic Alignments. This does have a lot of the information that we've talked about today in a written format, so you can reference it later. But in particular, it goes into some of the academic connections. So here, here we've got a chart that describes both the preschool and the kindergarten level as kind of the two age groups that we're focusing on for this particular document. And this is talking about how during SitSpot, students interact with their space, and especially are looking at seasonal changes, that kind of thing. If we just zoom in on the physical science for a moment, I'm going to pull up the Indiana Preschool Foundations and the Indiana Academic Standards for Kindergarten. And just listen to some of these connections. And I'd be curious to know if you're hearing and seeing the same things that I do. In that clip, was the student demonstrating the ability to explore objects in the physical world? Perhaps using senses to describe concepts of weight, motion, and force, or thinking about physical properties of objects. Over at the kindergarten level, plan and conduct an investigation using senses. Later on, perhaps in community circle, for example, explaining the choices of the investigation and generating questions about it. For us, this is kind of a no-brainer kind of a thing where we see this type of thing happening and we can connect it easily to these standards. But this is just an example of the way that we really justify and articulate that there's value in doing this kind of SitSpot thing, not just for the developmental reasons that we talked about in the first table, but also for academic reasons as well. Okay, well, we have a little bit of time here that we can open it up to questions and try to answer things that you're wondering about specifically. We'll try to wrap up pretty close to 5, but we can bleed over just a little bit if you'd like. So feel free to either unmute at this time and you can pose a question to us verbally, or if you'd prefer, you can pop things into chat and we can read from there. So things that you all are wondering about.
I'll ask a question. We tend to do our forest days off-site, but it's always at a different, not always, but it's most often at different locations. So what I'm hearing is there's probably value in maybe us doing SitSpots at our center out on the playground, as well as doing them off-site.
Yeah, I would say so, that in the conception of SitSpots as I think of them, that would really support some of the recurring or repeated exposure to the space. And it may make a little bit of a kind of foundation for them to then compare those visit days that you have to a place that may be drastically different.
We just don't have any trees on our playground, which makes it kind of like hard for us to find really good spots. So we'll have to think through that. But that's
sure.
Yeah.
And it could be that you're adjusting your time, right? Like in some ways, the physical location where we're holding our SitSpots is quite rich. There's lots of things on the ground, saplings and that kind of a thing. And so potentially that might engage the students differently than more of a playground setting. But we haven't tried that. So you might have to experiment and report back to us a little bit there.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah. Great question. Are there others with things that they're wondering about? Let's see, Carol, one that we often get a question of is, can the students really sit that long? You're the one out there regularly. What do you have to say about that?
Some of them can sit that long. All of them can engage that long, whether it's actually sitting or not. And again, we start out with a shorter block of time and gradually build that, kind of like working, think of it as working a muscle and gradually building up strength over time. It's helping the children strengthen their ability to be still and regulate, or explore quietly without always needing to engage with other children, engage themselves in exploring quietly for up to 15 minutes. Sometimes they would go even longer, but yeah.
I do have another question too.
Sure.
Obviously, this has been something I've been thinking I need to work more on this. Do they all, now you might have already spoken to this, I was late getting in, but do they all have journals when they go to their sit spot? Some of them may choose to use them and some may not. Is that what I understand?
For our program, all of the children have journals. I have not mandated that they always take them to their spots. At the beginning of the year, we model everyone taking our journals out with us to our sit spots. And then, but again, I don't mandate like you have to use it every day or anything like that, or even you have to take it with you every day. So some continue to take them with them every day. Others choose to take a hand lens. Others choose to take their whole backpack, and then they have it if they want it or they don't. So, yeah.
Yeah, different age levels, we've seen that kind of change and vary. I think from a very pure perspective, a sit spot should be something that a kid enjoys or looks forward to or kind of develops ownership over. So the more things that we're mandating, the less likely it is that it's something that they want. Now, that said, we have seen kind of at the elementary level that there are teachers who use that as writing time. And so they are asking or requiring a certain amount of reflection, perhaps, about what's going on in their sit spot. So that's that. And a lot of times that's not necessarily like something that the students are getting their arms twisted over. A lot of times they're very excited to be writing or drawing. And so, that's maybe a delicate balance. On like the far extreme side, there's a professor that works with us here who has done sit spots as a requirement for our graduate students getting their master's in environmental education. And for those students, the requirement is that they have their sit spot, they do it on their own over many different times of day, and including, I think in some cases at night, because you get different sense at night, right? And for the requirement there, that hasn't necessarily been specifically a written requirement, but there is some kind of a reporting out project that comes out of that, and that can take many different forms. And so I think as educators, it's an interesting challenge to think about what can we extract meaning wise from a sit spot without it being, every time we have to, do a writing assignment or something like that. And I think that varies a lot based off of the context.
Yeah, Carol, now, I don't want to be the only one asking questions, but I seem to be, but
go for it. Yeah. How about one more and then we probably better wrap things up.
So when they do their community time and they're sharing, does everybody share or do they only share if they want to share?
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, or asking for clarification on that. Children raise their hands. That's one of the skills we're working on.
Yes.
Raise their hands and wait to be called on. And some of them want to share and others do not. And so we're not requiring anyone to share if they don't want to for this particular program. Also, for our program, for our preschool program, have most days allowed 3 children to share. And so we're trying to spread out who is sharing, but it's a child-led community circle for the most part. And so whoever's community leader for that week is the one choosing who gets to share on a given day. And they could choose themselves, they could choose 2 other people, they could choose a total of 3, whatever that ends up looking like. Sometimes they choose a teacher. Sometimes they choose someone whose hand isn't up and that person says, I didn't have anything to share. Like, okay, choose someone else. So,
And you do the sit spots once a week,
we do sit spot every day.
every day. Okay.
And for us,
Or-
that is Monday through Thursday
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
from September through May, basically.
Okay.
And I will add actually almost every day. Sometimes when we're doing an excursion, which is a longer trip to a different part of Mary Lee away from our regular classroom, sometimes we include sit spot, sometimes we don't. It depends on where we're going and the structure of that day.
It's definitely fair to say that it's in our regular routine, and that's something that they come to expect.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Obviously,
well,
there's be more advantages to doing it every day, but if you're not able to do that due to scheduling, at least once a week might be, I don't know.
yeah, it's definitely a balance of kind of how much time are you wanting to commit to it, and how do you see the benefit of it. And we've done it even once a month when we had kindergarten students coming to Mary Lee just in that frequency, but every time that they came out, we did try to include that.
Okay.
Okay. For other questions, we would love to hear more from you, and we can follow up kind of offline, but we did want to end things up with just a few extra resources to highlight that we'll be providing to you. The first is, let me just change up my screen share here momentarily. Okay. It's not going to work for me. Hold on, let me just change some things real fast here. There we go. So we will be putting into the chat a link to this PDF that has some follow-up details for you related to some of the terminology that we've used today, as well as some pretty important links. So we've got a link to a sit spot guide from the Teton Science Schools, like we mentioned, and a few other pieces that we wanted to make sure to highlight. So first is that sit spot pedagogy document that I referenced in the slides. So this has all kinds of great information that you can reference. It's in alignment with what we shared today in the webinar, but has a lot more kind of bulleted out detail. In here as well is the link to the PDF of the Sit Spot, the book that our graduate student Madison Proctor wrote. And she has given permission for folks to access this, to print it out and to use. So we're very pleased about that. And then finally, going back to our slide here, I'll mention a few different things that we have kind of on an ongoing basis. The first is the Early Childhood Hoosiers Outdoors Network. This is a monthly gathering by Zoom where we share with each other what we're working on related to nature-based early childhood education. Anything from I tried sit spots and it didn't work, to I've been having great success with this thing, to how can we adapt something for my context. So that's something that's really easy to get plugged in at, and that is going to be in that follow-up document that I should make sure to put into the chat right now so I don't forget it. There we go. And then the other pieces I'll just mention is we do have both in-person and virtual professional development, example being this webinar and others. Many of those webinars are also posted online at our website so that you can watch ones that you haven't had a chance to participate in. And then there are additional online resources available, much like the Sit Spot document, but for other topics or considerations as you're thinking about getting students outside. And with that, I am going to stop our recording and thank everybody for coming. We appreciate you logging on and interacting and engaging with us. And best of luck as you work with students outside. We would love to hear from you and let us know what we can do to help out. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.